evening and welcome. Today we are discussing the day that changed history in modern warfare, the Battle of Balaklava, October 25th, 1854. Today with me, Captain Gibbons.
Sir?
We are here to talk about the day that changed warfare. So tell us about, what do people today think about when they hear about the Battle of Balaklava?
Two things generally come to mind. The first, far most famously, is the Charge of the Light Brigade. The supposed blunder.
Someone had blundered.
Someone had blundered.
There's not a reason
Tennyson
why.
poem, "There's but to do and die, into the valley of death." That, as far as people have heard of the Battle of Balaklava, I'd wager the overwhelming majority outside of academia have not. But among those with even a passing familiarity is the Charge of the Light Brigade. And second to that is a phrase that's recently been readopted, you could say, by military and law enforcement as either the thin red line or the thin blue line. But that phrase originated at the Battle of Balaklava, and it was the 93rd Highlanders, a thin line of red-coated British infantry that repulsed a Russian cavalry charge and was famously quoted as a thin red streak, as William Howard Russell put it, but has ever since been famously misquoted as the thin red line.
Now, to set the stage for the Battle of Balaklava, we have to go back and analyze the entire Crimean campaign. When it was decided that the Allied powers, France, the Ottoman Empire, and Britain, of course, decided to attack the Russians, it was decided that we would land in and around Sebastopol and try to take Sebastopol by siege if necessary, in 1853, of course. And it was decided that we would land in Calamata Bay and cross the River Alma, which is the Battle of Alma, another episode that we'll be talking about that, and then ended up landing north, but ended up south of Sebastopol. And Balaklava famously is the harbor whence most of the supply had been moved in. And since the armies were beginning to encircle Sebastopol, the Russian counterattack was aimed at the weaker defenses at Balaklava. Now, the first of the Russian attacks this day actually fell against the Ottomans, because the Ottomans had been tasked with defending a number of redoubts or small temporary forts which were guarding the outer parts of the Valley of Balaklava. And these were actually not the best Ottoman troops. Period accounts actually refer to them as Turkish militia, but today a lot of the accounts we know that they are Asnan, or very young recruits that were aged 20 to 25, and we know now that most of them were actually Egyptian. The Russian assault, of course, hits the first Turkish redoubt. They are overrun, and the rest of the redoubts, at the order of their officers, decide to withdraw. And so that, through history, comes off as the Turks ran.
Yeah,
and
they're
so
described in British sources as third-rate.
Yes.
Turkish soldiers.
And they're not the best Turkish soldiers, but they're also not dealing with the best of circumstances, no?
They were not. They were inadequately armed and poorly supplied at best. Some accounts describe them as practically starving in these forts, because you have to bear in mind, Balaklava is to the south of Sebastopol. The main Allied armies are entrenched around Sebastopol itself. And so Balaklava by this point is an afterthought. These redoubts are an afterthought of, just in case the Russians send a force down the Crimean Peninsula and they try to cut us off from the rear, we need some level of defense to slow them down to protect our line of communication through Balaklava. So these forts were an afterthought. They were, there's period accounts of force-sighted officers who in the end were proven right, were telling Lord Raglan, you need to improve these defenses because if we were the Russians, this is the weak point, this is where we would hit.
And what sort of armament does the redoubt have?
The British loaned them a number of British guns. This is light artillery pieces. But again, they weren't particularly good guns, and they were, this was the reserve of the reserve. The very back of the line, places where we're not expecting to be attacked, but just in case, we'll put something there. And that's something where these, as the British described them, third-rate Ottoman troops that were not on the top of the list for supply and equipment, and had been loaned a few British guns that ironically would play a significant role in what is shortly to come at Balaklava.
So the Turk runs. The Turk withdraws, and
Depending on who you ask, yes.
depending
They
on-
ran or withdraw.
they withdraw or they run, and the Russians obviously advance to fill that gap. And it's the 93rd that comes up to actually cover that withdrawal, no?
Yeah, the 93rd did not, they were at Balaklava. I don't know if they moved up, but they did form up outside on a small hill just north of Balaklava, and they're overlooking a valley between them, right in front of Balaklava. There's a valley about 1,000 yards wide, and then the redoubts that the Russians had taken, that the Turks had withdrawn from, was about 1,000 yards away. And so the Turks are withdrawing across this valley. Some of them formed up with them, some of them did not. But the 93rd, the Sutherland Highlanders under Sir Colin Campbell was among the handful of actual British forces that were there. The redoubts were not supposed to collapse that quickly. The purpose of the redoubts were to delay a Russian attack long enough so that the British or the French could send forces from...
How far were they
8
from?
miles approximately from Sebastopol. So the logic went that if the Russians did try to attack us from the rear, take our line of communications at Balaklava, they would have enough time to counter that by moving forces south on what the British would see as their interior line. They'd get there in time to hold Balaklava against a Russian attack. But as it happened, the Russians took the redoubts very quickly. They captured the British guns that had been borrowed. And this is primarily an attack of Russian infantry, a very large number of Russian infantry, possibly 20,000 or more troops.
But then comes the cavalry, no?
With cavalry, yes. The Russian infantry did not advance very far at all
Why is
beyond the
that?
redoubts. Because the Russian infantry, this is my theory, that the Russian infantry had been smarted by the British at the Battle of Alma, only about a month earlier, where the Russian infantry learned firsthand, very surprisingly, the power of the new British Minié rifle, the pattern P51 rifle, which had an effective range out to 600 yards for a man-sized target, and up to 1,000 yards for an area target, like a target.
Whereas
size
the
of a
Russians
regiment.
could only engage at...
At 200 yards
200.
at most. They were still armed with generally flintlock smoothbore muskets. And so the Russian infantry that had taken these redoubts from the Turks, well, first they had fought the Turks. The Turks, depending on whose account you read, either fought poorly or fought well. The fact they fought at all is +1 for the British, because the Russians at least had to engage them and were winded from assaulting from redoubts or fortified positions with guns in them. But the Russians had certainly by this point not been defeated. They were not exhausted. As they're looking out across this 1,000 yards of open ground, they're looking down from the heights down into Balaklava. They could see the harbor, they could see the buildings, they could see the British stores that had been landed from the ships. And the only thing that stood between them was, again, the 93rd Highlanders, with the regular British regiment, some Turkish troops, and a few battalions of Royal Marines. But the Russian infantry would have surely seen the feather bonnets and the crimson red uniforms of the 93rd Highlanders formed up in line. And that was enough to at least add one reason among the many, the inexplicable reasons for why the Russians did not continue their advance into Balaklava. By all the conventional dictates of warfare, nothing stood between them. Just a handful. There were only a few hundred British troops in the...
And they knew that they were a rifle-armed regiment based on how the Highland Brigade was engaged at Alma.
Probably, and they probably could have just assumed that after they had been so roughly handled by the...
But the Royal Marines did not.
The Royal Marines at this time, in October 54, were still armed with the older smoothbores. But of course the Russian infantry would have had no way of knowing this.
Oh, right.
The only British troops in Crimea at the time, the 4th Division, which would come up later in the battle, the 4th Division was still armed with smoothbores, either P-39s or P-41 smoothbore muskets. Every other division, all the other regiments and battalions, by this point had been armed with a P-51 mini rifle. And that had surprised the Russians at Alma when they're receiving effective infantry musketry fire from an enemy at ranges at which prior to then infantry could not hurt you from. It was a shock. The Russians had been attacked at Alma. They had been up on the heights. The British attacked them, and the Russians suffered twice as many casualties as the attackers. So this is already turning history or military convention on its head.
Indeed.
And so these Russian forces at this point probably were hesitant, knowing that the British had rifles, to cross this 1,000 yards of open ground. It would have taken quite a while for infantry to cross 1,000 yards. And in that time, a trained British rifle battalion could fire thousands and thousands of rifle bullets effectively at them. And have to bear in mind, these are trained soldiers of the 93rd. They received a handful of P-51 rifles before they left England. They received even more of them at Malta, and they were trained on the rifle under Colonel Lane Fox, who had been sent from the School of Musketry to Malta to train these soldiers. And everyone, whether you were a soldier that still had the smoothbore musket or you had the new P-51, everyone was trained on the new rifle. And finally at Varna, on the coast of the Black Sea, immediately they embarked from Varna before they landed at Kalamata Bay. Everyone in the 93rd, the entire regiment, had been issued with the P-51 rifle. And this is the work of Lord Harding, who shortly after the death, he became Commander-in-Chief of the British Army. He was the driving force behind giving every British soldier a rifle. And the 93rd had received these, had been fully equipped with them at Varna. And period accounts say they were conducting considerable target practice with them. So these are trained soldiers. They had received trained instruction from Colonel Lane Fox from the School of Musketry, which had been founded a couple years earlier. So these are soldiers that understood how to estimate the distance to the target. They knew how to properly adjust their sights. They knew how to load their weapons. They're trained, and by this point, they knew how to use their weapons.
And based on our experience with the American Civil War, not every army puts that much effort into the individual soldiers' familiarity with the rifle and familiarity with just judging distance, any of that.
No, many American Civil War regiments, and I might even go out on a limb and say most, did little to no musketry training. And there's a large number that didn't fire. These soldiers were volunteer soldiers, enter the army. They don't fire a round until they're actually being engaged by the enemy.
Well, that's a conversation for a
That's
different
for the
day.
future.
Yes.
But the 93rd, even by British Army standards, by later British Army standards, were very poorly trained in the rifle, even though by this point they had more training than the average American Civil War regiment would have had. Within 3 or 4 years, they would have been considered trained to a substandard level to that which was expected of British Army regiments by the later 1850s. But for the Battle of Balaklava, for our purposes, they have a modern weapon, a rifle that the individual soldier can aim with effectiveness out to 600 to 1,000 yards, and their enemy know this because their enemy have already gotten a bloody nose.
And so that's why you believe most of the infantry did not advance.
It's an explanation. It's a possibility. Historians have scratched their heads at why didn't the Russians advance at Balaklava. They had overwhelming numerical superiority. They had taken the primary resistance. I mean, the redoubts on top of this ridge were the primary British line. They had broken, or the Allied line, I should say. They had broken through that line, and they had the numbers. It was very early in the day. It was about 9:30 in the morning by the time they had taken these redoubts. Yet they stopped, and one possible reason could be, and this is my theory, was that this Russian infantry knew the 93rd, or that they saw the red coats of the British soldiers in the distance 1,000 yards away, and they knew that if we advance from here, we will be under effective rifle fire the entire way, and we will not be able to actually fire back until we're within 200 yards.
So we talked about infantry, British infantry being superior to Russian infantry here. Let's talk about infantry versus cavalry, because that's what everyone knows from the thin red line, no?
Yes. The Russian cavalry may not have been engaged at Alma. Alma was primarily an infantry battle, and the Russians were on the defense. So if you're on the defense, you don't engage your cavalry unless you're trying to exploit a weakness or do a counterattack. The cavalry may have, in typical cavalry fashion, dismissed the concerns of the infantry that were hesitant to advance across 1,000 open yards of ground against British infantry. From the cavalry's perspective, this was a hussar, or the Russian equivalent of a hussar regiment. I want to say it was the 17th. They saw fresh meat in the distance because there's a line of infantry, unsupported infantry. So this is British infantry. The heavy brigade of cavalry was coming up. It was not on the field yet. They see a line of British infantry 1,000 yards away, unsupported by artillery. And at about this time, the Russians had placed guns up on the hills where the redoubts were. And the Russian artillery, from a range of about 1,000 yards, had opened fire on the British and Allied line. There's up to about 2,000 Allied troops there, of which there was the 93rd Highlanders and then an assortment of other Turkish regiments armed with smoothbores. And when he came under artillery fire, Colin Campbell, the commander of the 93rd, advanced his regiment a short distance so that the soldiers were slightly behind the crest of a very shallow hill and had them lie down. And this gave them just enough cover. This probably wasn't more than just a few feet of elevation. So don't think of a large hill he was behind, a shallow bump in elevation. And he advanced his soldiers to that and had them lie down or kneel down. And this was enough so that the shot from the guns, at least it was provided some measure of cover. And Russian artillery saw this. So what they see is British infantry, unsupported, under fire from artillery, hunkering down, taking cover. And for cavalry, this is a win-win situation. The cavalry begin to advance because under the rules of conventional warfare, of Napoleonic European Western warfare, the British now, the infantry have two options when they see cavalry coming at them while they're under artillery fire. Option 1 is to form square. This is the formation that you adopt when you are being charged by cavalry. It brings all your infantry into a dense square, and the horse is not a particularly bright animal, but it's not dumb enough to charge into 3 ranks deep of soldiers with bayonets. The horse will not do it, and they will invariably break and go around the square. And while the cavalry do that, they subject themselves to the fire from the soldiers in the square. However, that formation is a beautiful target for artillery. So if the cavalry advance and they force the infantry to go into square to resist cavalry, that means the gunners up on the hill can knock them over like bowling pins at their leisure. So either way, the Russian belief going into this is the British are about to have a bad day. No matter what they choose to do, we're going to have our way with them, whether they stay in line and therefore are vulnerable to the cavalry charge, or whether they form square and we can just plunk cannonballs through the ranks with our artillery. The advantage, the initiative is completely on the Russian side, and the Russian cavalry probably were thinking, well, there's a bit of glory in this for us too, because if we rout this thin red line of British infantry, there's nothing else between us and Balaklava. We can say we were the first ones into Balaklava in this great victory that took the line of communications of our enemies and destroyed all of their supplies. So there's a strong motivation to just knock these British and Turkish infantry away and take Balaklava.
So then the cavalry begins to advance, no?
They do. And a cavalry charge, the cavalry cannot gallop the entire way. They have 1,000 yards of ground to cover. So they would advance the first several hundred yards at a walk, and then the next few hundred yards at a slow cant, and then the next few hundred yards at a slow trot. And the last 150 yards or so is the actual charge, and it takes time, even from the trot to a full run, for the horse to build up that speed. And it's a catastrophic thing being charged from cavalry. Because that last 150 yards, when they break into their run, a good light cavalry could cover that in 6 seconds, or no more than 10. So if you're an infantryman, in the context of warfare that the Russians are fighting in at the Battle of Balaklava, infantry with musketry have a maximum effective range of about 150 yards. So if you're an infantryman and you're being charged by cavalry and you see this wall of horse and steel charging at you, you know you have one shot and you have 6 seconds in which to deliver that shot. And if that one shot does not stop this charging mass, you know you're about to be smashed by tons of horse flesh and men and
that's
steel.
why that instinct is
and
to
that
form
the
the square.
instinct is generally to run, and that's exactly what the Turkish troops did that were supporting the British. The Turkish troops ludicrously fired one volley at about 700-800 yards and then turned and ran. With smooth bores. It was a completely ineffective, pointless. If one musket ball hit one Russian cavalry horse, I would honestly be surprised. They fired and ran because they knew what was coming. Like we're out here, we're standing here in the middle of the open. We have no artillery supporting us. There's no cavalry supporting us, and we've got one shot. And as soon as these cavalry get within range, they're going to lower their lances and plow right into us.
And the square is very much ingrained into the British infantrymen. They, in a way, they almost live in the shadow of their fathers and grandfathers at Waterloo. So at what point did Sir Colin make that call to go not into the square but to form the line?
He did not form square from the first. His famous quote was, we will stand and die here. And he had already observed the power of this new weapon, the rifled musket, at the Alma, where the 93rd was engaged, quite hotly, in fact. And he realized that if he formed square, only about 25% of his soldiers in the square would be able to deliver fire on the enemy cavalry as they advance with their rifles. If he keeps his soldiers in line, 100% of his soldiers can fire on the enemy as they advance. So he very courageously placed his faith in the rifle on October 25th, 1854. Abolishing the conventional wisdom that you must form square. That's the only thing you can do when unsupported infantry is charged by cavalry. Instead, he formed what William Howard Russell called a thin streak of red tipped with steel that we know as the thin red line. And this just goaded the Russians on. They're like, these silly British this is going to be too easy. They're making it way too easy for us. We're going to knock them over like bowling pins. And the Russian strategy, or their tactic, would have been not to charge directly at them, but at the last moment of the charge, they would turn to one side, and then before the British could refuse their line, the cavalry would come around and take them from the flank and the rear. So, and there's no escape from that. If your infantry caught in that, it's just you get run down and lanced and hacked to pieces. It's what a cavalryman lives for. So the Russian cavalry move up, and Sir Colin Campbell waited until the Russians were about 600 yards away when they fired their first volley. And historians disagree on how many volleys were fired. It's pretty clear from the primary sources that they did fire 3. The first at 600 yards. This one was not terribly effective, and that makes sense. It is the longest range. The dispersion of bullets would be the greatest at that range. But can you imagine being a Russian cavalryman, and you're charging infantry, and you're moving forward 600 yards away, you're still barely moving forward at a slow trot, and the enemy infantry in the distance fires at you, and you can see that they fire because there's still black powder weapons, a great cloud of smoke, but you hear this whizzing zip of bullets about you, and some bullets inevitably hit targets, and the thought had to have crossed their mind, like, whatever the Russian is for, oh crap, we are being effectively engaged by these British infantry. And I wonder if some quick pang of doubt crossed any of their minds. Maybe we should pull back, but they didn't. They pressed on, and the British had reloaded by the time they got within 350 yards, and there was a second volley. And this was very effective. At 300 yards, considering the trajectory of the bullet fired from the P-51 rifle, all you had to do was aim pretty close, and your target is still within the power of the rifle. At 600 yards, given the rainbow trajectory of the rifle, you have to estimate your distance pretty much exactly. If the enemy is at 600 yards and you set your sights to 700 yards, you're going to send the bullets right over their heads. And if you set your sights for 500 yards, the bullets are going to land in front of them. You have to get that range exactly right. But at 350 yards, you could set your sights to 400 to 300, and the bullets are still going to hit somewhere on that approximately 8-foot target from the top of the Russian cavalryman's head to the bottom of the hooves of the cavalry. And that second volley was incredibly devastating. The Russian cavalry continued to advance, and they began to turn to their right, would have been the British left, to begin to go around. They were still intending to go around and take them from the rear, and Colin Campbell refused or wheeled out a few companies on his right flank, and they fired a third volley at very close range into the flank of the Russian cavalry as they were starting to make their wheel around the British line, and that was it. At that point, they turned and began heading back towards from whence they had come.
And he didn't fire back into them, did he?
He did not fire as they withdrew. He said something to the effect of, damn your impertinence, for the soldiers that wanted to. The soldiers wanted to run and chase the cavalry, and he held them back, and he, with tremendous chivalry, did not fire into these retreating Russians. And he certainly could have. He could have fired at them 2 or 3 more volleys as they withdrew. And it's interesting that many Allied accounts sometimes doubted the effectiveness of these volleys because not too many Russian cavalrymen or horses were left on the field. The volleys did not unsaddle very many Russian cavalrymen.
Because the Russian accounts said they hung on.
Yeah, there's a wonderful account of a British soldier who went to St. Petersburg after the war, and he ended up talking with a one-legged Russian, and they both, I suppose the Russian probably spoke some English, but he said, oh yeah, we were in the Crimea, and the British soldier said, oh, I was as well, and where were you at? And the British soldier said, I was at the Alma and Balaklava, and the Russian cavalryman with the one leg, the former cavalryman, said, oh, I was also at the Balaklava, and we attacked this one little British unit right in front of the city, and the British soldier said, well, that was us. And the Russian cavalryman said their second volley had basically wounded every man and horse in the entire Russian formation, and that most of the men that had been wounded, you did not want to be unhorsed in the middle of no man's land, to borrow a later phrase, in the middle of a battle, because if you fell off your horse in the middle of that field 350 yards away from the British line, that's where you'd bleed out and die, especially if you've just been hit by a 705 caliber British Minié rifle bullet. So they, wounded or no, you hung on to your horse and tried to follow back to get back to your line, so that you don't fall off and die in the middle of this field. So, but from the British perspective, the volleys were a little less than satisfying because there were relatively few Russian men and horses left on the field. But from the Russian account, their second volley in particular had, according to that Russian survivor, the one-legged, and that was where he had been hit, and then he lost his leg, but he hung on his horse long enough to get back to their lines. He said the British volley had been incredibly effective at 350 yards, so 150 yards beyond what the Russian, what Western military conventional thought at the time. 150 yards beyond the maximum range that infantry can actually reach out and effectively hurt you in battle.
Now, we've discussed infantry versus infantry. Russian infantry doesn't advance for a great portion of this battle. We've discussed cavalry versus infantry. And of course, later on we can discuss cavalry versus artillery, because there's a lot to talk about when it comes
not to reason why.
Yes, ours not to reason why today, but we're certainly going to reason why very soon with the Charge of the Light Brigade, because Lord Cardigan did nothing wrong. But let's discuss infantry versus artillery. Let's talk about that.
Well, you can start off with the general truth, the unquestioned truth that infantry at ranges beyond 200 yards is ineffective against artillery. In fact, artillery, up until this point, and this is one of the reasons why I argue that Balaklava, October 25th, 1854, is the day war changed. The Russian artillerymen on that battlefield at Balaklava went into that battle under the assumption that the firmly held and justified assumption that infantry cannot hurt you unless they're within about 200 yards. And for infantry to get within artillery to that kind of range was remarkably rare anyways. And if infantry was foolish enough to get within artillery, the artillery had a type of ammunition, a canister, that was essentially a case full of musket balls, or a little larger than musket balls, but basically round iron or lead balls that turned their guns into massive shotguns. And that was effective to about 300, 350 yards. It's the most powerful thing on the battlefield. There's nothing more destructive than artillery firing canister into infantry, as Confederate troops would learn in July at Gettysburg, 1863. But the infantry versus artillery exchange happens at the very end. In fact, the Battle of Balaklava is essentially over. This is after Lord Cardigan did nothing wrong, and those Turkish guns that we mentioned had been in the redoubts. The Russians had captured them and were trying to hold them away, and so Lord Cardigan was supposed to run them down.
Well, Lord Raglan did not want those guns to be carried away.
He did not.
And just like we talked about with people living in the shadow of the Napoleonic Wars, had any other British guns been carried away in previous wars, really?
Not in recent history, and Lord Raglan knew very well that Wellington, the old Iron Duke, who had only died the year prior, had never lost a gun. Again, in all his years on the peninsula and in France and Belgium, and in India, he had never lost a gun to the enemy. And so Lord Raglan was...
Because of course British guns have been captured before, but you didn't want to, you lived in Wellington's shadow.
No, you didn't want to be the one to have to write back and say, yes, I lost the first British gun in 50 or 30 years.
Yes.
If you don't count the Afghans took a few guns.
Well, there's Gandamak and all that.
Yes, they took a few guns in the retreat from Kabul in 41. But anyway,
woe to the 44th, and we'll be talking
44th.
about the massacre at Gandamak another day. But
the Russians, they took these Turkish redoubts, and the battle's over. The Light Brigade had charged, and that was over. This was about noon, or a little after noon. And again, the whole purpose of the redoubts defending Balaklava was to delay the enemy's advance long enough that troops from Sebastopol, French and British troops, could take the interior lines down quick enough to hold Balaklava in the case of Russian attack. And one of the units that had been alerted very early that morning when the report of the Russian attack on Balaklava was received was the two rifle battalions of the Rifle Brigade. This had until recently been the 95th Rifles. In 1816, in the downsizing of the British Army, they went from the Rifle Regiment to just the Rifle Brigade, but they're essentially the green-jacketed 95th Rifles of Napoleonic fame. And they were one of many units, basically the entire 4th Division under Cathcart had been sent from the trenches of Balaklava down, or trenches of Sebastopol rather, down to Balaklava. And that was 8 miles away. And the rifle battalions had double quick marched from Balaklava, those 8 miles to, or from Sebastopol. I need more gin. From Sebastopol to Balaklava. And so by the time they got there, they had already basically ran 8 miles and were quite winded. And they arrived just in time for the battle to be over. They arrived to see the remnants of Cardigan coming back from their charge, and for all intents and purposes the battle was over, except for this one Russian battery. It's described as a 6-gun Russian battery up on the hill And it was almost certainly one of the batteries that had been, cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon before them. One of the Russian batteries that had fired against the Light Brigade. Now that the Light Brigade had withdrawn, they're looking for targets of opportunity, and they see the 2 battalions of the British Rifle Brigade moving up ahead of the 4th Division. And so these gunners, at about the maximum effective range of about 1,000 yards, casually open fire on the advancing 4th Division. And again, the enemy, the British 4th Division and the Rifle Brigade advancing in front, they're 1,000 yards away. There's no reason for these Russian artillerymen to be in any kind of haste or hurry, so they're taking their time. And bear in mind, in 1854, the artillery branch of the military, the artillery and the engineers were the intellectual branch. That's where the men of the greatest education, and it was the scientific branch. Frederick II famously said, artillery lends dignity to what otherwise would be an ugly brawl. And again, it's the only branch in conventional military understanding at this time that can actually reach out and engage targets at ranges beyond 200 yards.
And they're the ones needing to do range estimation.
They were really the only ones that had to have that specialized knowledge. And another topic for another day is how the rifle, as the first modern infantry weapon, forced soldiers to become more than just a robotic automaton loading and firing a smoothbore musket and not really caring where his bullet goes. The rifle, the adoption of the rifle forced the militaries of Europe and eventually the world to have to train soldiers, and the soldier becomes more than just this blindly obeying barked orders. He has to think for himself. He has to calculate his own distance. At this time in the Russian army, that was strictly the purview of a few Russian rifle battalions and artillery. And so here, the Russian artillerymen would have been estimating their distance and watching their fall of shot, and they would have been lobbing round shot into the advancing 4th Division. And General Cathcart, commanding the 4th Division, now bear in mind the entire 4th Division was armed with smoothbores, but the Rifle Brigade
was used to supplement them.
Yes, the Rifle Brigade was advancing in front of them kind of as a screen or a skirmishing force. And they obviously had, they received their mini rifles in February, so they had them for some time. And prior to that, they had been armed with the Brunswick rifle, so they already had known, these soldiers were the Rifle Brigade. They knew a bit about rifles and were very proficient. General Cathcart specifically requested a lieutenant in the Rifle Brigade, a very 25-year-old lieutenant, Arthur William Godfrey, to advance with a small section that's been period sources describe it as a company or as like a group of skirmishers. It was about a squad to a platoon size element. It certainly wasn't a company. Godfrey did not command a company. But think 10 to maybe 20 riflemen. And General Cathcart asked him if he couldn't advance and try to silence those
The single
Russian
lieutenant.
guns. The lieutenant with 20 men said, "Can you go forward and try to silence these Russian guns?" And of course, Lieutenant Godfrey, who had done similar feats before, he had enlisted, or he had been commissioned rather, into the Rifle Brigade at about the age of 16, and he had fought in what was then known as the Kaffir War, the Third Kaffir War, where he had been wounded in South Africa. And so he's already a combat veteran. He's already spent, he's 25 at this time, so he's spent the last 9 years of his life shooting rifles, and a great deal of that time in combat against a very determined enemy. And he had already been distinguished outside of Sevastopol holding his ground against a Russian sortie. So General Cathcart would have known who he was, and they would have appreciated his skill at leading small units of men. So General Cathcart asked if he would go forward with this small body of troops to try to silence this Russian battery. And they were about 1,000 yards away. The Russian guns at the time, you gotta bear in mind, all the artillery, the field artillery of this era, has to be drawn by horses. So the lighter you can make the guns, the better. These Russian guns would have differed very little from the type of guns they used during the Napoleonic War. So they were almost certainly bronze, which is lighter than iron, or God help us, steel, so that horses could easily draw them. Probably between 6 to 12 pound smooth bore guns that had a maximum effective range with solid shot of a little over 1,000 yards. So they were at about their maximum effective range, just lobbing solid shot into the British lines when General Cathcart sent Lieutenant Godfrey forward. The mini rifle, an area target you could engage at 1,000 yards. The bullet would carry that far, and
It's a large bullet.
it's an enormous bullet. But it could, the sights on the rifle went to 900 yards. And with some training, soldiers could fire even beyond 900 yards. But that's for a fairly large area target. To engage an artillery battery, Lieutenant Godfrey needed to get a little closer. And he advanced, and as he described it, he took advantage of every slight undulation in the ground. And you can imagine the Russian artillerymen, and they're watching this group of 20 green-jacketed riflemen approaching them, covering a couple hundred yards. Lieutenant Godfrey didn't explain how they did it, but you can imagine they would wait for the Russian guns to fire and then either sprint or crawl along. He just said they took advantage of every small depression in the ground to give them cover as they advanced on these guns. And he advanced them up to about 600 yards. And 600 yards is about the absolute limit at which the P-51 rifle could engage a man-sized target.
And what's the caliber on the P-51?
It's a 705.
705
705
grain
caliber.
cal. All right.
Yeah, the bullet was 690, but it had a hollow base so that it could be easily loaded. But when firing, there was an iron cup in the base of the bullet, just like the actual Minier bullet, not the later Burton bullet used in the American Civil War, but the real Minier bullet, iron cup that was driven forward into the base of the bullet when the rifle fired, and that's what expanded it into the rifle. And so it was 705 caliber when it left the barrel. It weighed well over an ounce. So Lieutenant Godfrey advanced to about 600 yards. And this is frustrating for the Russian gunners because the Russian artillery were using fuses that were essentially unchanged from the Napoleonic War. And if you're firing case shot, which is an exploding shot, the explosion of the shell isn't actually what causes the damage. The explosion simply bursts the shell apart while it's still moving at high speed. And that spreads out the fragmentation, and these case shot would have been filled with bullets, with lead balls. And so when they would burst, it just scattered this over an area. But the slower the projectile is going, the less effective this bursting is. And 600 to 700 yards for Russian case shot of this era is about their maximum range. And any further beyond that, and the falling fragmentation would cause contusions, as the British described it, but it would not, unless it maybe hit you on the head. I imagine that could be fatal. But it's going to bruise you, but it's not going to be a serious wound. And of course, canister, they could switch to canister. But that lost its effectiveness at about 350 to 400 yards. These British riflemen, the only shot they could really fire at them was their case shot at the maximum extent of its range. The Russian artillery was inferior to the British artillery of the time. The British had better fuses, they had a higher muzzle velocity. Their artillery case shot could engage at longer range. These Russian guns, by comparison, were far more primitive. So they could fire a case shot at 600 to 700 yards at the periphery of their range, or they could fire a solid shot against this group of 20 or so riflemen. Lieutenant Godfrey said the shot was passing thick and heavy over their heads, which I would interpret as case shot, but they could have been firing round ball. At either rate, the Russian artillerymen were doing their absolute best to fire on these crazy British riflemen that had come within 600 yards. And that's when Lieutenant Godfrey opened fire.
And what happened?
Then what happened?
And what happened?
For about 20 minutes, it was a duel between antiquity and modernity. Antiquity being the Napoleonic, the linear black powder musket era of warfare, which was represented by the Russian artillery, versus modernity, which is the modern infantry soldier is armed with a modern infantry weapon that can engage individual targets on his own at long ranges. And for 20 minutes, this went back and forth. After a few minutes, the Russian artillerymen realized we're in big trouble. And you can imagine these Russian artillerymen firing at the British riflemen as they advance, hearing the British bullets. Now we've fired Enfield muskets, which use that very similar cartridge to the P-51 Minier, and when we fire them, we can hear the bullets flying down range, just going down. And so the Russian gunners were certainly hearing these bullets flying in among them, and one by one, hitting the gunners as they serviced the pieces. And you have to imagine the bronze guns. If a 1 ounce piece of lead flying at about 700 to 800 feet per second hit a large piece of bronze, it would ring out like someone is clanging a bell. And I'm sure that would have given a little more sense of urgency and purpose to these Russian gunners. But after about 10 minutes, they realized we're really getting the worst of this, and they began to hunker down behind their guns, and occasionally they would jump out and try to reload to fire. And this is about the time that Lieutenant Godfrey, who was by all accounts an exceptional shot, he began having his soldiers load their rifles and hand them their loaded rifles, and he would aim and fire at the Russian gunners whenever they would pop out from behind their cover. And so in this way, he probably could fire 5 or 6 aimed rounds per minute. But over the next 10 minutes, he completely silenced the Russian battery. The Russian gunners, every time they attempted to dart out and reload their guns, he would shoot the gunners as they were trying to load. And he silenced the battery single-handedly. One British lieutenant, 600 yards away from a battery of 6 guns, silenced them. And after about 20 minutes after the first British rifle shot, the Russian artillery finally said, "We've had enough." They grabbed their guns and began pulling them away to the rear, and they withdrew. So one British rifleman not only silenced, but drove away a battery of 6 guns, which is a feat unheard of in Western warfare up to this time. And And again, that's why I call, the Battle of Balaklava the day warfare changed. You've got infantrymen, just simple, plain old line infantrymen, defeating a determined cavalry charge when, by all rights, under the old rules of warfare, they should have just been ran over like bowling pins. And you've got a group of 20 British riflemen, not just silencing, but driving off the battlefield a battery of artillery with their regular infantry weapons, no specialized weapons. This was what every single soldier, by the end of the Crimean War, every single British regiment either had the P-51 or the P-53 rifle. So this isn't some specialized secret weapon. This is every single soldier has it. And the regular weapon that the regular infantryman has is defeating artillery.
Artillery, infantry, and cavalry.
And cavalry. And it massively increased the power of the infantry. Period sources would... they seized upon Godfrey's exploits as kind of a bright point in the Battle of Balaklava, because the charge of the Light Brigade, after Tennyson got hold of it, someone had blundered. There's not a reason why. All that was left of them, left of 600. It eclipsed, the Light Brigade eclipsed everything else at Balaklava. The 93rd got some deserved recognition.
And there are even some misconceptions about the 93rd, it being this desperate holding action, and just by the skin of their teeth they held off the Russian cavalry charge. But very clearly they halted long before any charge happens.
They did. Well, Sir Colin Campbell told his soldiers, this is where we die. He placed his faith in the rifle, but he and his soldiers knew full well what was going to happen if their rifles didn't do their job. Fortunately for him, they did. Unfortunately for the poor Russians, and Russell, who wrote the phrase "the thin red" or the thin streak tipped with steel. He was the Times correspondent at the Crimea with very colorful language. He inspired Tennyson,
and he ended up covering the American Civil War quite a bit, to his detriment.
He was quite prolific. He was not welcome anywhere.
Yeah, yes.
But
still sold newspapers though.
Yes, he later at the Battle of Inkerman, he described the mini rifle as a destroying angel. He said that the mini rifle, it smote the enemy like a destroying angel, which is an apt description. You have to put yourself in the position of a Russian soldier, a Russian cavalryman, a Russian artilleryman, where your weapons, the weapons you have, cannot hurt the enemy, but the enemy can effectively engage you at these long ranges. It's rare, very rare in warfare that you encounter a situation as clear cut as this. Eduard Todleben, who was the Russian engineer, probably more responsible than anyone else for holding the line at Sevastopol for as long as they did, complained very vigorously that our muskets, we have to be within 300 paces of the enemy to hit them with our muskets, but the British are hitting us at 1,200 paces with their rifles. And so
And they truly realized that at Balaklava.
At Balaklava, and particularly not many days later at Anchorman.
Which is a story for a different day.
For a different day, but that's when they realized we are not able to defeat the British in the field. That all we can do is hold out at Balaklava and try to outlast this siege.
So my last question to you will be, do you think that there's another battle in the 19th century that has lasting and overwhelming effects on military history that people really can point to and say military doctrine, military procedure, military history changed that day as much as Balaklava?
19th century?
That's the century.
The very end of the 19th century, 1899, the Boer War, where the Boers with Mauser, with 7mm Mauser rifles, took rifles to the next logical step. Now, a year earlier at Omdurman, 1898, the British were still fighting in very much the same way they fought in the Crimea, in closed ranks, and the
giant square.
With the square, and the dervishes very obligingly fought them in the way the British expected to be fought. And they had Maxim guns and everything at this time, and they just cut them down. And that experience at Omdurman, the British thought, well, this stuff still works. And they took Crimean War era tactics. In the Crimean War, the British tactics were ridiculously ahead of their time. Their logistics were a total shambles. They were very, very good tactically, and they failed crucially in that one aspect of modern warfare that matters more than anything else, that is logistics. But they fought at Omdurman in the old Crimean War style, in closed ranks with volleys and the whole 9 yards, and won against the army of the dervishes. But a year later, in South Africa, the Boer riflemen utilized the modern rifle the way it, to the full extent of its capabilities, the same way the British utilized the P-51 Mini rifle to the extent of its capabilities, and the Boers, you can say it was a dress rehearsal for World War One. Behind trenches on the ground level, not up on a hill, not at any height, and they relied on the flat trajectory of their Mauser rifles to do the work.
No more rainbow arcs.
No more rainbow arcs. These are very high velocity, flat shooting rifles, and in three pretty remarkable battles. These Boer farmers gave the advancing British bloody noses, one after the other. Colenso and Magersfontein and the Modder River, and etc. But no, that's the only. Unfortunately, there's no battles of the American Civil War that you could say tactically were infantry battles. There's the only remarkable battle in the American Civil War, you could say, that changed or that demonstrated new technology, was the ironclads at Hampton Roads. But again, the British had already seen that coming. They had ironclad
HMS Warrior is ready to
Warrior
go.
was already in commission. Yeah, I'm sure this is a topic for another discussion, but the American Civil War was a tactical and strategic regression, and the weapons that they had were through really no fault of their own, due to the fact that you have volunteer armies of rank and competence, including your officers. You have officers commanding regiments who don't know the first thing about war. The contrast could not be greater to the British regiments in the Crimea, where Sir Colin Campbell had been in the army since he was in long trousers, and soldiers like Lieutenant Godfrey have been shooting rifles since they bought their commission at the age of 16.
Well, I blame McClellan because he was there. He saw it. He was
observing
observing in the Crimea, so
he should have done better.
He should have seen something. Should have taken notes. So thank you all for staying with us on our long discussion on the Battle of Balaklava. Hopefully it changes a few perceptions about this battle, and hopefully it sparks some discussion on the day that modern warfare changed for the average infantryman.
The day that changed modern war, as I would have it.
Yes. Well, thank you all, and until next time, carry on. Shall we away?
Sorry.